Good morning and welcome to Renew Canada's InfraIntelligence series. My name is Corinne Lynds and I'm the content director here at Actual Media. I'll be your moderator for today's discussion on harnessing green energy to achieve net zero. Before we get started, I'd like to thank PCL for sponsoring this webinar, and I'll give you a quick tour of the Crowdcast platform so you're able to get as much great information as possible. By now, you've probably noticed everyone checking on the right-hand side the chat feature. Please say hello, let us know who you are and where you're from. And because we are Canadian, we always like reports on the weather. It is sunny and a little bit cloudy here in Toronto today. Right above the chat, you'll see an Actual Media icon. If you click follow, you'll continue to be updated on our InfraIntelligence series as new webinars are announced. And down below, you'll see a variety of information. You can see how many people are signed in to today's webinar. You'll see the polls feature where we encourage you to cast your votes. You'll also see a little green button with rotating links to the speaker's website. So be sure to check those out as well. And most importantly is the Ask a Question feature. So don't be shy about becoming part of the conversation. I'll do my best to pose your questions to our panelists throughout the discussion. This is our fourth InfraIntelligence webinar of 2022. In January, we talked about disaster resilience. In March, we did a deep dive into public transit projects. In May, we discussed efforts to expand capacity at several of Canada's largest ports. And today, we're checking in with the experts on harnessing green energy. Don't worry, if you missed any of those, you can access recordings on Renew Canada's YouTube channel. We have an impressive lineup of speakers joining us today, but before I jump in and introduce them, I would like to take a few moments to acknowledge the many First Nations and Indigenous peoples of Canada as the original stewards of this great country. I'm here in Toronto, which is located on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. We all share in the responsibility of our natural infrastructure, and there's much we can learn from the traditional knowledge of the land, water, and materials that allow us to build projects that benefit all Canadians. All right, so let's meet our experts. I am going to begin by inviting each of our panelists to the screen. Once they're all on screen, I'll have each of them spend a couple minutes to introduce themselves and quickly tell us just a little bit about where they're from, what their role is, and what perspective they're bringing to today's discussion. First up, we have Andrew Moles from TCL. Give him just a moment to come up to screen. There he is. Welcome, Andrew. And then we're going to call Robrert Hornung from Canadian Renewable Energy Association up next. Hello, Robrert. Good morning. And then we have Chief Sharleen Gale from the First Nations Major Projects Coalition. Welcome, Chief Gale. There she is. Beautiful. And then we have Pranav Shah from the Canadian Infrastructure Bank.
Good morning.
Beautiful. Look at that. We all nice and smooth. All right. I am going to start. Pranav, I'm going to start with you. You're top left for me, and I'm going clockwise here. Would you take just a moment and introduce yourself, who you are, where you're from?
Happy to. Hi, everyone. I'm Pranav Shah. I'm a director on the investments team at the Canada Infrastructure Bank. For those who may not know, the Canada Infrastructure Bank is a federal crown corporation with a mandate to deploy $35 billion in investments in 5 priority sectors. We seek to develop new partnerships and bring a private sector focus to achieve Canada's environmental and sustainable goals in infrastructure. We use these relationships to attract and co-invest with private sector and institutional investors in greenfield infrastructure projects. We're an outcomes-focused impact investor, so our goals are to value essentially the outcomes for projects, and we're not risk-return associated like other investors would be. And we, again, don't have a one-size-fits-all investment process. We try to tailor build a bespoke process for each of our investments, try to understand the risks that each are facing, and try to create a solution that bridges that gap.
Fantastic. Thank you. All right, Robrert, you're up next.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. My name is Robrert Hornung. I'm the president and CEO of the Canadian Renewable Energy Association. We represent almost 300 companies that are active in the deployment of wind energy, solar energy, and energy storage across Canada. And those companies are working to deploy these projects at multiple scales, large utility scale wind and solar farms, or the solar panels that people are putting on their roofs at home. We are very keen and believe that our technologies are going to play a very large role in facilitating Canada's journey to net zero. We think we're going to need a 10-fold expansion of wind and solar energy capacity in this country in the next 30 years to get there. And we are going to be working to advocate for the responsible and sustainable development and deployment of these technologies across the country. We are a national organization, but we are active in advocacy work with all provincial governments as well as at the federal level.
Awesome. Thank you. All right, Sharleen, over to you.
Hi guys, so sorry, I have a lot of background noise, so I'll have to put my mic on mute here and there. There's equipment working behind me. So calling in from the traditional territory of the Fort Nelson First Nation up at Toad River Mountain. We're Treaty 8. Our territory is about the size of Switzerland. I'm also here representing the First Nation Major Projects Coalition as the chair. If you aren't familiar with our organization, the First Nation Major Projects Coalition started with 11 nations, and we have over 90 nations in 7 provinces and territories. And we're currently working on a project portfolio of capital of 17 billion spread over 7 different projects, where all of them involve equity positions for the First Nations partner. One of our main goals is to enhance the economic well-being of our members by supporting them to make informed business decisions in major resource and infrastructure projects. And I'm just really glad to be zooming in today to talk about some of these projects, including the geothermal Tudeka project we're building in Fort Nelson First Nation. That's 100% owned by our people. So happy to be here, and I'm actually camping right now, so I just zoom in for a little bit and get back to camping in the Great North.
I'm a little bit jealous. All right, Andrew, go ahead.
Thank you. Andrew Moles, I'm with PCL Construction, director of our solar business. So that spans all of US, all of Canada and Australia, and anywhere else we may venture out to. We're a Canadian-based construction company headquartered in Edmonton, first established in Saskatchewan. I've been in renewable energy since 2009 as one of the members of PCL who wrote a business plan based in Ontario to open a renewable energy division solely focused on that sector. We had a lot of success in solar, some success in battery storage, and we made the choice for myself to take the helm and take it outside of Ontario, across Canada, US, and Australia about 7 years into our venture, and to focus solely on solar and BESS with my group. I do have a counterpart who's focused on wind, who sits in our Edmonton office. I'm based out of Toronto. As you can imagine, I'm on planes often and traveling a lot and trying my best to offset my carbon footprint with making good things happen in the solar business. I used to sit on CanSIA's board prior to the amalgamation to CanREA. I sat as vice chair of the utility scale solar division of SIA, which is the US organization, for a few years, and generally passionate about this industry, clean energy, and moving ourselves forward from carbon producing energy sources. And extremely excited and honored to be on a panel with such great people today, and hope I can be of value from my perspective from the construction industry specifically.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. All right, we have so much good stuff to talk about today. Maybe before we dive in, I'll just take a moment to kind of set the scene a little bit. As we as a country set out on what is bound to be a transformative journey to reach net zero GHG emissions by 2050, it's clear we need a powerful boost from the wind energy, solar energy, energy storage, and others. These technologies, along with others, will play a central role in driving rapid decarbonization and massive expansion of electricity production required to make net zero reality. So today, we're going to dive in and talk about how far we've come so far, what challenges remain, what solutions are needed, what investments required, and how we're partnering with our Indigenous communities. And of course, we'll talk about projects and successes that give us good reason to be very optimistic for the future. So let's begin in what I consider my favorite places, which is basically getting a lay of the land. The consensus is that it'll take a combination of green energy sources to get to net zero. What role will each source, such as solar, wind, geothermal, and energy storage, and others, play in our decarbonization journey? And I know that's a big question, but I'm kind of just opening the floor up here. So Robert, perhaps we can get you to kick us off, and then I'll get the rest of the panel to jump in.
Sure, happy to try and kick it off. I think we're going to need a very diverse set of energy sources, non-emitting energy sources, to move us to net zero. And I think we have to start first, and priority number one has to be looking at energy efficiency. We have to be thinking about how we can use our existing energy as efficiently as possible and the new energy that we're going to need going forward. And we're going to need a lot of new energy. In particular, we're going to need a lot of electricity. If you look at all of the studies that have examined pathways to net zero, they all conclude that Canada is going to essentially need to double its electricity production between now and 2050. That's a mammoth undertaking to double our electricity production in less than 30 years. But we need to do that because we need that electricity to help decarbonize other sectors like transportation, with the explosion we're seeing in electric vehicle growth and electric mobility, in buildings and heat pumps that we're going to see become a greater part of our sort of electricity infrastructure, and also in heavy industry going forward. So when we look at that sort of massive growth opportunity, where's that going to come from? Well, there's going to be a lot of contributors to it, but we're quite confident the wind and solar energy are going to be front and center in that. And why are they going to be front and center in that? It's because they're the lowest cost sources of non-emitting electricity available in Canada today. The cost of wind energy has declined more than 70% over the last decade. The cost of solar energy has declined more than 90%. And so when you look at that, we want to ensure that this transition, which is going to be moving at a pace and a scale that we've never seen before, is going to be affordable, and we want to ensure that it's going to be reliable. And that means that these technologies are going to play a key role. The Canadian Climate Institute released a study just earlier this year that looked at studies that have been conducted in the last 18 months for pathways to net zero in Canada. And what those studies concluded was that we're going to have to move from about 6% of our electricity today coming from wind and solar to somewhere between 31% and 75% of our electricity coming from wind and solar by 2050 in an electricity system that's twice as big as it is today. So it's an enormous opportunity. There are real challenges, but there are also solutions. And we're keen, and I think we'll explore in this panel how we can take the steps necessary to enable us to deploy these technologies at the rate required to enable us to achieve our goals.
Fantastic, thank you. All right, who would like to jump in on this one next? Do you want to have a go for it, Andrew?
Sure. I completely agree with Robert. There's no one solution to the electricity needs of the future for Canada to get to non-emitting renewable energy sources or energy sources. We need to use a multitude of technology. Solar and wind are very, very economical now. They weren't when I started in 2009 in this. I mean, we were putting solar panels up that had 90 watts in them. Now they're 750 watts. We were using inverters that were 250 or 125 kilowatts. Now we're seeing them at 5 megawatts. The technology has significantly improved, and it's significantly reduced the cost of this electricity generation. And I think there's still a lot of rumors out there that you have to pay to be green, and you have to pay more for renewable energy, and it's just not true anymore. The uptake globally is economical and the right thing to do and sustainable. I think making some key changes, opening some markets up for private and for government and investment will pave the way to make this possible. And I do think it's going to be a combination, of course, and we have such a diverse grid as it is. And there's a lot of sources right now that are clean and should be relied upon for many years to come. But there's more generation required, and there's more facilities reaching end of life that frankly don't serve a purpose or likely won't serve a purpose in our future grid.
Thank you. Excellent. Go ahead, Sharleen.
Yeah, I believe that, some people are in denial that we're actually going through an energy transition right now. But, as First Nations, we have big ambitions, and we think equity ownership is the key to creating a brighter future for our people in this transition to net zero. Across this country, First Nation people are the biggest owners of renewable projects other than governments and local municipalities. So that's something we have to keep in the forefront. This definitely is going to be a bumpy ride, and none of us want this to happen to us. We want to lead it, and we also want to benefit from it. But to make that happen, we have to actually start thinking big and acting big and build back better. And that can't just be a slogan. It's actually a call to action. And I think as you start looking at this transition happening, you'll see Indigenous people are ready and they're stepping up to help position Canada better on this path. When I look at all the projects that Indigenous people are doing across this country, whether it's our nation with the geothermal project, LNG, wind, biomass, battery storage, I definitely see us being a big player in this transition, and we want to do more of it, because when it's done right and when we're involved meaningfully, it really elevates our the poverty in our community and addresses the legacies of colonization. So that's one thing that I think going forward that people really need to understand, that to get access to these critical minerals for lithium and what we're going to need into the future, you're going to have to access Indigenous lands. So we really want to be involved in this, and the world needs more energy from Canada, especially considering the global energy shortages and impacts of the limited supply to the war of Ukraine and what's happening on the other side of the world. We have a really good opportunity if we can all come together, especially with Indigenous communities that are going to be affected by these extractions for these critical minerals going forward. And I just hope that, we can actually really come together with industry and government and like-minded people like yourself to make this happen, because we all know that in Canada, we have the best environmental practices, and when you involve the First Nation partner, we're one of the best partners, because we just don't focus on the prosperity. We really balance that approach through economic prosperity and environmental stewardship. So I just, really want to achieve, good things with this energy transformation, and, really provide a low carbon project, through the Fort Nelson First Nations geothermal plant, which I hope to get a little bit more discussion on that in a little bit here. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Sharleen. Pranav, would you like to add your thoughts?
Sure, absolutely. I couldn't agree with more with the panel here. I think it will take a combination of the sources of energy that we've talked about, but it will differ in different geographies. Like, our grid is somewhat fragmented province by province, and the challenges that each province and utility and system operator face in each of those jurisdictions is different, right? And so I particularly think storage has a key place in all of this, because it's going to unlock the opportunities for renewables to have higher penetration rates. And we're seeing this across the board. Like, if you take the perspective of a system operator or a utility that's running the grid, what they're trying to do, because of legislation, is remove thermal generation essentially from their grid and replace it with intermittent renewable generation. And so that in itself needs some sort of balancing tool, right? And I think the role of energy storage, is critical in unlocking those higher penetration rates. I'd like to take the time to talk about our Oneida project in particular, which is a First Nations-led project. We have the privilege of working with 6 nations in the Grand River, who partnered up with a private sector developer, EnerStore, and went to the ISO in Ontario with the vision of how to build a storage project that takes on risks that the ISO cannot take on, and also, sees a vision in terms of, this is a project that's unique to Ontario because of the dynamics of the Ontario power market, and it adds a balancing service that lets other renewables connect to the system in the future. So these are the types of partnerships we're trying to cultivate at the bank.
Thank you. I think we've got a good topic today, because we've got more questions than we've tackled ourselves yet already coming in. So that's a good sign. Although one of them is a self-proclaimed hot button topic: is nuclear energy green? I know nuclear was bound to come up at some point. So let's just take a second now. Would anyone like to comment on that?
Personally, I'm going to have to pass. I'm not an expert in that.
Fair enough. Go ahead, Robert.
Yeah, I'll just offer a reflection. Nuclear is clearly non-emitting. And
Right.
And I think from that perspective, the role that nuclear is going to play going forward, I think, is going to be determined in large part by economics. At the end of the day, we need, as we talked about earlier, we're going to need multiple. It's a massive expansion we're talking about. We're going to need a lot of different technologies to do it. And ultimately, because of the size and scale of that transformation, we're going to be looking to do that in the most cost-effective way possible. And I think if nuclear is going to prove to be cost competitive with other technologies in terms of providing that, it's going to get very serious consideration in terms of helping us to address this challenge.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. SMRs are coming. There's pilot projects that have been announced. There's still a bit of a ways out before we connect anything and figure out the economic models of it. But if they can compete, their market penetration is probably going to be significant, and it's going to be a big piece of our grid moving forward. If they can't get the economics to work, then they're going to have trouble with penetration, because frankly there might be other technologies out there. So it's a bit yet to be seen how big of a market slice it'll take, but certainly we're at PCL seeing that as a big opportunity for us in the future, and we've got a team in front of it, and we see that as something that's going to help us reach our goals for what we've been calling non-emitting electricity generation.
Awesome, thank you. I should say we did do a webinar on nuclear last year, and anyone who's interested could check that out. It will be in the Renew Canada YouTube channel. All right, so let's get back to the regularly scheduled questions. So the demand for renewable energy sources, there's no doubt. I think Robert mentioned it. It's, the need is doubling. So coming years, we're going to have to figure out a lot of good stuff. But what are the challenges? So what are we facing? What are the challenges facing the governments and the private sector developers as we look to meet our emissions goals? And I've noticed that the other question we have here is actually talking about extreme weather events and the need to make the grid more resilient. I would see that as one of those challenges, I think, too. So that might just fit right nicely with this question. Who would like to jump in and talk about the challenges a little bit first? Pick on everybody. I'll just start pointing at you. Go for Robert.
If nobody will jump in, I'll kick it off.
Okay.
I mean, I think there are some real challenges. We're going to need to mobilize a tremendous amount of investment and activity to be able to move forward and do this. That's going to require, first and foremost, some policy certainty and clarity in terms of going forward and sending clear investment signals. We have, what happens to the carbon price after 2030? What does a clean electricity standard really look like? What does net zero by 2035 mean? These are real questions that we need clarity to work on and work through. We also have to recognize that the electricity system in 2050 is going to look really different than the electricity system today. It's going to be much more decentralized, much more diverse, much more democratic in the sense that many, many more individuals and companies are going to be producing power. We don't have a regulatory and market framework that actually enables that. It's actually right now a barrier to that happening. So there are a lot of regulatory and market reforms that have to happen to enable us to capture the potential of a whole range of disruptive technologies that are out there that can bring us benefits right now going forward. We are going to have to invest in new infrastructure. That can be challenging in terms of going forward and making that happen. We need to ensure that we're actually developing comprehensive strategies that support electrification in areas like transportation and in buildings and in industry, not just one-off measures, but really a comprehensive plan to get there. And we need to ensure that as we move forward through this transformation, that we take steps to ensure what people have described as a just transition, and in terms of ensuring that this does provide opportunities for disadvantaged communities, and Chief Gale spoke very well about the opportunities that are present and that we need to capitalize on for Indigenous communities as well going forward. So I mean, we can list a whole bunch of challenges, but we have to recognize that for every one of those things we talk about, we flip it over and it's a tremendous opportunity, and that's what we need to focus on.
That's great.
I can jump in next, and there's plenty of challenges as you touched on a bit, but province to province comes with its own challenges with getting approvals to start projects, connection approvals, net metering opportunity. We see places that have had a lot more success driving the price down and opening up for more private investment, really focusing on virtual net metering opportunity. It's not available widely across Canada. So that's a huge opportunity to drive more investment and drive this market, getting larger scale projects opened where cost and economics pencil a lot better in different provinces, such as Ontario, where it hasn't been available to the market yet. Labor is a huge potential issue. This is a big energy transition. We are already tapped out in our country with respect to skilled trades and construction workers to build out the infrastructure plans that we have, not including the energy transition. So figuring out how we're going to train people, attract, retain people, and frankly, get the quantity of people and equipment. And this impacts more than just the on-site construction, but there's a whole support industry that goes with this in transportation and off-site manufacturing and so on and so forth. This is a big wave that's coming that's going to require a lot of people and going to employ a lot of people, but we need to make sure that we're preparing ourselves, and whether that means increased focus on skilled trade immigration or other things, we need to solve that problem as well, or we're going to have all these projects and no one to build them. Of course, there's tariffs that are driving up costs that are in place right now, and there's a potential opportunity to shift more to a incentivized local manufacturer or local content program rather than a tariff foreign program. So there's some opportunities there where we could look at some smaller scale or tweaks to our current policies that make the investment more attractive and drive the cost down for the industry.
Thank you.
Yes. So I'll just go in here. Education and training for trades is definitely a huge issue, especially with the baby boomers retiring. We've been working with our nation and the local municipality to do an 8-week program of introduction to trades for our youth and our members. And at the end of the 8 weeks program, they can decide whether they want to be involved in millwrighting or pipe fitting, operations or maintenance in that respect. But one of the big key challenges for Indigenous people to be involved in these projects is the access to capital, and that's competitively priced capital. We've had opportunities before where we were invited to have equity in a project, but by the time we went for financing, the financing rates were like credit card rates, so it didn't make sense for us to actively participate due to that. But historically, as we know, we have been part of our economies for over thousands of years. And, when the Indian agent came in and nations signed treaty, we were pushed to reserve and stripped of our wealth. And it has made it hard for us now to provide the equity we need to be partners and to reduce the risk, therefore the cost of borrowing. Times are changing. Some nations are at a better advantage than others, but that is one of the key challenges that I see is to secure competitively priced capital for us to invest in these projects so that we can be leaders in this transition. I know that I've worked with the Canadian Infrastructure Bank. They've been really helpful in providing advice to us, especially with our geothermal project. But we need other financial institutions to really look at this and come together, because I think for us to be successful as a country and bringing everybody in this transition together, we're going to need a new financing system in Canada. And that's in order for First Nations people to be true partners with a shared vision for this low carbon future. Without us, I don't think that this transition is going to happen. We've seen what happened with oil and gas transition. There's a lot of failings there because First Nations people were continuing to be left behind. And that's how the coalition was formed by the 11 communities that just had enough. And they want to be, meaningfully involved in these projects that are on their territories. And whether that is like a huge project, like a pipeline that covers a mass amount of land where First Nations can come together as a group and work towards that shared financing, because historically, when we were pushed onto reserve, we watched the municipalities and your guys' communities grow. And now we want that for our communities because we need, fresh drinking water. We want to build our schools, our health and wellness centers, and have the same opportunities as other Canadians in this country. So that's why I think it's really important that we're involved meaningfully, and we have to overcome the challenges for First Nations to have access to capital in a meaningful way that has low interest rates that makes sense for us to be involved in these projects.
Thank you. Pranav, would you like to jump in with your thoughts on the challenges?
Yeah, just picking up on the last note there. So the CIB does have a targeted program for Indigenous communities where we've earmarked $1 billion across our 5 priority sectors. So we're actively working with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit to explore opportunities with them and enhance projects that are in their communities and hopefully give them a meaningful ownership in them as well. But back to the broader question around the challenges of increasing renewable energy. Like I think, as I mentioned in my last comments, energy is complicated because it's jurisdictional, right? It's you have to look at it province by province, and then you have to weave together this federal policy around emissions that kind of has to dovetail with each individual jurisdiction differently. And so each jurisdiction is faced with different challenges, right? And so at a high level, if you put your shoes against the system operator, to the utilities shoes, or into their perspective, they have to rip out what they've already built, right? So there's a cost to that, and then they need to rebuild something that's cleaner, right? So appreciating that, I think, is the first challenge, right? It's Taylor making a solution that says that we acknowledge that there's tremendous cost there. There's also an opportunity to augment the grid and make it more resilient at the same time, right? But it all comes down to costs. And so I think that's where the bank in particular can be of assistance. We, broadly speaking, across our 5 priority sectors, we seek to bridge 2 types of gaps essentially, or a combination. The gaps are economic and risks, right? And so as we're coming up with solutions, we're constantly asking ourselves, what kind of risk can we remove away from the ratepayer and share with the private sector, right? And things like volume risk, things like price risk, those are things that we can effectively help share. And it's not always, you don't always have the right jurisdiction where you can take that risk on perfectly, but there are circumstances across this country where you can take that on. And again, I point to our NIDA project where we've helped the developers take that risk on, and it's led to a meaningful partnership between the ISO and those developers.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. What I love about this conversation is we talked about what the challenges are, but everybody went right ahead and actually offered solutions as well, and thoughts on what we need to do. So that's a very proactive group of folks.
Could I just add to the risk?
Yes.
Just alluding to what he was talking to, and I think that when investors look at Indigenous people as partners, it's a good thing, because if we're working together successfully, then regulatory approvals will be smoother, projects costs will be reduced, and we can build projects on time. Investment risk will be also reduced, and you'll see the value of having an Indigenous partner. Also, with the Indigenous knowledge and our people being on the ground, the environmental impacts will be lessened, and we'll be able to bring good practices to these projects by our involvement. We have been collecting cumulative impacts data since 2010. In the Fort Nelson First Nation area, we have the Blueberry River court case that talked about these cumulative impacts with the fracking industry that came in. So when we look at that, I think that by having Indigenous knowledge involved, we can analyze what's going on the land, because the animals moved in a certain way, the insects do things, and we could provide that knowledge firsthand to you right up front, more faster than you can analyze your data. But when we're involved meaningfully, then you'll see more Indigenous businesses, you'll see more Indigenous communities benefit and contribute to the industry. You'll see our communities being lifted up and built. And I think that this path going forward will create a strong economy for First Nations and for Canadians across this country, and we want to be involved in our economies, going forward in a meaningful way. And I think that this is it. You travel across this country, and there's so many renewable projects that are happening in communities. Like I said, with like solar panels in Treaty 8 territory, we have wind farms. There's just so many things that are actually happening, and they might be happening on a small scale, but they're still happening. And the communities are running these programs and these projects on their own, within their own membership in remote communities. So got to remember that.
That's great. Thank you. So we've talked a little bit about challenges, trying to balance out and be super positive with this as well, because there have been a lot of successes as well. And in just doing a little bit of research ahead of this webinar, I couldn't help but come across a lot of news surrounding solar and just how that's doing. So Andrew, I'm going to start with you on this next one. I know PCL has seen some significant growth with the solar division, but I know you've been involved in the solar industry for a long time. So why don't you jump in and share some success stories with us in that sense?
Sure. And I think the biggest success story for the solar industry in Canada has just been the significant decline in the cost of energy production or electricity production. And I look back to 2009 when I started doing some research and understanding what the landscape looked like. And we look back at some of those contracts with the OPA at that point in time in Ontario and what those rates were. And there was some incentives to achieve those rates with domestic content requirements to drive a local industry forward, gain some experience. And we are a big benefactor of that program, being PCL. We jumped in with both feet, not on the development side, but on the construction side. We learned the industry, we set up locally, and we were able to take that across the country, into the US, into Australia. And for Canadians, I mean, we're repatriating money from other locations based on a skill set that was built by an initially heavily subsidized industry that really got it going. We see the rates come down significantly in Alberta. We're seeing contract for differences models and things like that being put in place, where the electricity generation may actually be sold for more money than what the developer IPP is getting paid for it, because frankly the spot rate pricing is above the contract rate that was agreed. So that's a win. That's a big win, and that's a huge success for the industry. Us as PCL, we rode the wave in Ontario. We've expanded outside of Canada. Not as much interest for this call, but what we're doing in Alberta right now, I mean, we built a very large project for Canada a couple of years ago, and we're bringing online in the very fast pace Canada's largest solar project, which is 692 megawatts of DC energy, capped at 465 at the connection point. And we're bringing that online from when we fully mobilize to when we're going to be fully complete in about 15 months. And that's impressive on a global scale. That's not just impressive in Canada. That is a real success for the industry, and specifically puts Canada on the map as a country that can build solar and renewable energy efficiently and effectively, and for the ratepayers, hopefully end up being savings for them at the end of the day, because frankly, when you build it at that scale, it becomes so much more economical.
I can go next. So one of our success stories is, so the Fort Nelson First Nation has the 3 biggest gas plays in North America. And we were bombarded with fracking in 2010. We didn't have a lot of knowledge of what that actually meant. Fort Nelson First Nation's been involved in oil and gas for over 50 years. We're very industrious, and our community enjoys being a part of the economy that happens in our territory. But one of the things that was a stopper is when the provincial government said no environmental assessment for gas plants. That was a big, alarm bell for our nation. So we had to ask the government to actually, take a step back and leave from our meeting that we were having in Fort Nelson, where we invited Indigenous people from the Haisla Nation all the way to Fort Nelson from ship to shell that were going to be affected, along with federal and provincial and regulators, partners, so we could have a really good discussion how we could build this pipeline together. That discussion went sideways with the decision of no environmental assessment. What Fort Nelson First Nation took a big stand on. With that, the gas prices definitely crashed, and we've seen a lot of oil and gas activity just leave our territory. So we were in a recession for years. It gave a lot of time for our members and our elders and our people really to come together to talk about what do we want to see moving forward for our economy, and how are we going to be involved meaningfully. And we know that's through equity. So the Fort Nelson First Nation partnered with the town of the municipality to secure the biggest community forest in BC. Since then, we have formed our own little partnership company, have a really good board of directors, and we're looking at developing a pellet plant in Fort Nelson to start reducing some of the emissions with the dirty fuel that people are burning in this country. And then what we're looking at is a bright green hydrogen facility where we're doing a study to see if we can use the waste materials from the pellets, the stumpage, and different wood fiber out there to create bright green hydrogen. That is under investigation, and we're just studying that. But the biggest success that I would like to share is that Fort Nelson First Nation had the Clark Lake gas field, and it has now been depleted after 50 years. And it did provide a lot of orange source revenue to our nation over time. And now that it has been depleted, we have repurposed that site for the geothermal site, which is supposed to produce 7 to 15 kilowatts of power, which would be able to power about 14,000 homes in Fort Nelson. And if you've ever been to Fort Nelson on the Alaska Highway, mile 300, you know that we don't have 14,000 homes, let alone 3,000 people when the economy's really low. But that's huge, because this facility is going to be owned by our people 100%. We don't have another partner. We're working with like-minded people like the CIB, who's been very helpful with providing advice on how we can be successful. We bring that to our memberships, and they make the decisions through the Daytai corporation. But really, really excited about that project, because up north here we run on diesel. I'm sitting in our territory about 2.5 hours from our reserve. And everyone's running on propane or diesel or some other, fuel that we want to try to transition off of. Food security. Food security is another huge issue in the north. As you travel up north in NWT, Yukon, and Alaska, the cost of food is rising. We already see that in our local cities and towns. It would blow your mind if you were at the market in NWT at Fort Good Hope, and you go to try to buy a steak. It could be up to $80 to buy that steak, where you go buy it in Vancouver for maybe $20, $15. So that just kind of puts things in perspective. It costs a lot to have food. So with the geothermal facility, if we can get 100 greenhouses going and provide fresh food affordable to our cousins up north, then that's something that we look forward to being able to do with the heat rights. And, the drill site is actually on site right now, and we're looking at what the brine will bring. So maybe there's opportunity for lithium and other critical minerals that we're going to need for this transition. So we're learning, and we're willing to share our knowledge with the world as we move forward on this project, because it's one of the first in Canada. So if you're traveling through Fort Nelson, please reach out to the Fort Nelson First Nation, and we'd be glad to host you in our community.
Thank you. Pranav, Robert, either of you would like to add on successes?
I think we're seeing a number of transactions across the country. Again, we have conversations going on with each of the utilities in all the provinces and territories. We're seeing an increased reception to, these discussions around implementing renewables in a more strategic way, right? Like, where can we share with the utility and with the private sector this volume and price risk? And we're seeing that in kind of combination with, okay, here's a wind farm, or here's a solar farm, and here, how do we supplement it with the battery so we can actually replace an entire natural gas facility, right? And so those are conversations that we couldn't have 2 or 3 years ago, but are starting to take flight and starting to really move forward in a quick manner.
Yeah, I can just add a couple of things. And I'll speak more to trends. I mean, the cost trend that Andrew spoke about has been critical in terms of something to be very positive about going forward. The power of consumers is increasingly obvious. So if we look in Alberta, where we have a deregulated electricity market, just in the last 2 years, there have been 2,000 megawatts of new wind and solar energy projects announced because of responding to corporate demand, wanting to procure that power. And we're starting to see across the country innovations in regulatory structures in provinces like Nova Scotia and Saskatchewan, also to respond to corporate demand, because there's this growing interest. Why can't I buy this power? And so we're starting to wrestle with how to do that. Building on what Pranav said, initiatives like the Clean Electricity Standard have fundamentally changed the conversation in Canada. We're now looking at a much broader range of options and being much more innovative and creative in terms of thinking about how we can combine different technologies to move towards achieving our objectives. And I guess the last thing I'd just say is, I think on the Indigenous clean energy released a study now, probably a little over a year ago, highlighting that there were 70 projects already in Canada, wind and solar projects that had Indigenous equity ownership within those projects, and that's really just the start of a wave that's coming. I think it is now standard procedure within these industries to ensure that you look for those opportunities to build those partnerships and relationships going forward. You see governments increasingly mandating that new development has to have those components, and that's all very positive, because aside from just being the right thing to do, it has a whole range of other benefits to support the transition, as Chief Gale was talking about earlier.
Fantastic, thank you. Well, we've heard the term investment coming up a fair bit. In terms of the need for clean power investment, what are the opportunities for public funding, such as the Canada Infrastructure Bank, Pranav, and private sources to play a role in getting green energy projects built? Pranav, it feels like the right place for you to start on this one, so I'll let you jump in.
Happy to start there. I'd like to take the time to maybe talk about our relationship with the province of Nova Scotia. Some of you may have seen a recent auction that they've held for renewables in that province, and it really highlights our relationship with them, because we've been working with that province in particular for about 2 to 3 years now to help them on their mission of decarbonization. Right, so they're being proactive and saying, look, we've got an existing thermal footprint that's quite heavy, and we need to figure out how to get that offline as quickly as possible. And use the immense wind and solar resources that they have, mostly wind in that province, to kind of help that transition along. And so what we designed with them is a royalty product that was made available to all bidders. And what it essentially did is it helped lower the cost for all the bids on equal terms, but it also shared some of that end-of-life risk with the bank. So traditionally that'd be held with just equity, but we were taking risk on what happens after that initial contract that's awarded ends. So to the extent it doesn't materialize, we will then not take as much of a return, right? And so we thought that was an equitable way of sharing in that risk, and it really added an accretive financing package to a lot of communities in particular that wouldn't have access to capital otherwise. So we thought it was a great way of kind of doling out a lot of participation from the CIB in a way that closes or helps to close the economic gap when measured against other forms of generation, and shares in a risk that traditionally equity would have to hold.
That's very cool. All right.
I'll go next. I still feel that there's an outdated view among some players in industry that Indigenous groups are more of a cost center to the project, and that we're a risk to be mitigated through cash buyouts and other tactics. And sometimes I call this the bead and blanket approach. But I think there's also another number of people in corporate Canada that are waking up to what I've known all along, that Indigenous people, add value to partnerships. And by partnering with us, we can increase the long-term profitability of a project. We can raise the ESG ratings of that project and de-risk investment from the unresolved Indigenous interests. What I'd hate to see is this transition happening with so much conflict with the media. They always draw to they always draw to the challenges of a story, but they don't look at the successes. And I know that some media outlets are really trying to change that and how they report their stories and focus more on the positive side of that. But we are aware that due to the lack of direct interaction between the financial sector and Indigenous groups on an investment screen basis, that media reports are often relied upon and influence decision making. So that's a problem that we're trying to solve through the First Nation Major Projects Coalition. We really want to see people to see that there is value in partnering with Indigenous people. And last April we had a very successful conference where we brought in over 1,300 people at the Western Bayshore in Vancouver, and there was a number of different industry types that were just blown away by the forward thinking of our membership and the commercially focused agenda that we had. We look forward to being able to continue to have those discussions, because I think it really reflects on, how we can do this transition smartly, that respects and includes community interests wholly. And I think that, this partnership is a two-way street, and the coalition has a really important place an important role to play in this conversation and this dialogue. And I think that the more deals we do with true Indigenous partnership, the more we're going to change minds on the outdated ways of thinking about Indigenous groups as financial partners. And that's one thing that I always say is don't underestimate the ability of my people. They just keep showing up, and they're really innovative, and they're strong, they're proud, they're self-reliant, and they just surprise me every day with their ability and their thought process and how they just want to move future generations forward. And when I say future generations, I don't just think about our grandchildren and our 7 generations moving forward. I think about your grandchildren, and how do we work together to move this transition 100 years from now, 1,000 years from now, because we're definitely going to need it. And we all live on the same planet, and we all want the same thing, to be able to look after our families and to live in a really good environment. So I just wanted to add that. Thank you.
Thanks for touching on that. And you were touching predominantly from the financial side. We have a lot of experience as a company working with Indigenous communities in all aspects of construction. So different sectors. I personally have had the pleasure of working with offsite manufacturing, assembly, and construction work with a number of different communities. And you hit the nail on the head. If it's done right, it's value add. It's not cost add. And there is a preconceived opinion on that I think is old, outdated, or was never correct. And I just wanted to say, from the construction's perspective, if you get it right, it can be very advantageous on the construction side of the business as well. And you talk about financing opportunities. We work a lot with Export Development Canada, the EDC, when we're doing work outside of Canada. We've also been in conversations with them for support for local projects to gain experience in new technologies or newer technologies that can be exported afterwards, and that we could be building in other countries outside of Canada afterwards. And they've been very receptive and very open to working locally first and then exporting that expertise later. So there's a few different avenues where the government funding is there, and there's some programs there. And I think just more education and more access for others would be make great steps towards getting there. And we talk about solar and wind, but SMRs came up earlier, hydrogen came up earlier, renewable natural gas, that's a real topic right now, waste energy, things like that. These are the type of industries that haven't really kicked off too much globally, and specifically in Canada, where those type of financing options are available as well.
Yeah, and I just wanted to also say is that some companies are even going a step forward, and they understand the situation that First Nation people are currently in. So what I've seen in my territory is developers and investors coming in and saying, look, we want to build this project, and at any time that you don't feel comfortable or your people don't want to move forward, we're going to pull out and we're not going to build the project. However, if you want to be involved, we're going to give you equity, and we're going to give you 49% equity. Don't worry about the investment. Don't worry about the financing. We're going to build the project. We're going to turn the key, and then we're going to come and help you go get the financing so that you can get your equal share of revenue and equity into this project, so that you can look after your people for the lifetime of the project that it will be operating in your territory. And I found that very, very helpful, and that is really, really helping move the project forward, where we're working in collaboration to get past some of the policies and regulations that really put a damper on First Nations so that they can't be involved. So I just wanted to also talk about that model of what's happening in some of our communities already.
Thank you. I cannot believe how quickly we're whipping through this. We have just 7 minutes left already. One topic that we haven't, there's several topics that we haven't got to yet. We're going to need to do a follow-up webinar, I think. But one of the big topics that keeps coming up, and we've talked about it from an investing perspective, but also, how can the private sector and all the various levels of government collaborate, not just to accelerate investments, but in general to reach net zero? Obviously we need the money to make a lot of this happen, but we've also heard, I think, from Andrew, and I know we have this issue in most industries, that provinces have different regulations. There's different policies across the country. How can we be better collaborating across the country to get to net zero that much quicker?
So I'll just start.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say that, when industry or investor looks at developing a project, the first thing that you should do is go to a First Nation day one. If you want to be successful, is really include them into the project. I already talked about how you can reduce the costs. First Nations know where projects can and can't be built. I've had this challenge myself. The last thing I want to be doing is sitting in a courtroom fighting with industry when we could actually build a project together meaningfully that meet both of our values and the interest on the land. So that's one thing that I wanted to say. I think you just need to come together. One of the panelists talked about, the problem from province to province and how we all operate differently. We need to open the doors and start being collaborative and not make this a competition between Alberta, Ontario, or BC and Newfoundland. We really need to look at this transition as a holistic view for this country. This is the best place in the world to build these projects. And if we take note to what our membership have been saying from the coalition is to include us from day one, I think we'll see a huge change. And we have a lot to offer. So I think the more we just come together and look at the policies and regulations holding us back in this country to move these renewable projects forward, we'll all be successful.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I would support everything that was just said, and then would sort of move on to speak as well about sort of the relationships between provinces, particularly in terms of electricity. I mean, electricity is primarily an area of provincial responsibility. So the federal government has fairly limited leverage in terms of moving that forward. But we have seen essentially historically, we really have amongst the provinces 10 unique different electricity systems that, the operators of those systems are working to optimize those systems, which is great. We want that. But what happens with the limited amount of cooperation occurs is that nationally we have a suboptimal system. And that's quite common. And that shows up in terms of how we're interconnected. It's very challenging to increase interconnections between provinces. We have different regulatory frameworks. You cross a border and all of a sudden things are totally different, causes issues. We don't have common operational procedures in terms of electricity between provinces necessarily either. And so this does pose a real challenge only because we know that to move at the speed and scale that's required, that sort of collaboration is going to be absolutely essential going forward, especially if we're looking for cost-effective outcomes. So we're starting to see more discussion like that in Atlantic Canada. You hear discussion around the Atlantic Loop and sort of joint regional planning. You see Saskatchewan and Manitoba engaged in more conversations about how they can support each other moving forward to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We need to see more of that in Canada if we're going to be successful.
Thank you.
And I can speak from construction and project side of things. Without driving up the cost with tariffs, find ways to incentivize and drive local manufacturing markets and to find ways to attract the labor, whether it be local with training or whether it be foreign, to build these projects as economically as possible and remove as many gating items as you possibly can to the process at the federal level to make these things more attractive for foreign investment and to hopefully drive risk out of the projects. If we can find a way to have our local manufacturers compete with foreign manufacturers to set up a big pipeline so investment can come and set up these plants that are going to be sustainable here, that will go a long way with de-risking projects as well. And contingencies will come down for people like ourselves, and contingencies will come down on the developer side, and the ratepayers will pay less.
Thank you.
Corinne,
We are down to...
Could I just add one little thing to follow up on what Andrew just said, which is just, we've talked a lot about investment here, which is really incredibly important. What we haven't talked about is that we're actually competing for that investment. Canada is not the only country in the world going through an energy transition. It's happening all around the world. And investors are looking to make investments in the places that provide them with the highest the least uncertainty and the highest potential rate of return. So there's a strong interest in increased collaboration in terms of ensuring that we're an attractive destination for investment going forward, because we are in a very serious competition for that.
Thank you. We are down to our last minute. Pranav, I'd love to give you the last minute to just weigh in quickly before I wrap this
Robrert
up.
actually stole my thunder there, and I was going to say we operate in a global marketplace, and we have to understand both and respect that there's other jurisdictions that are less fragmented and they have more clarity around their policy, right? And so why would investors take that risk here? This is a question we need to ask ourselves. At the same time, there's other markets globally that have advanced and solved some challenges that we're trying to fix right now. So there's learnings we can take in from them as well to employ. And the last thing here that I'd like to touch on is building a set of common assumptions. I think is going to be key, right, between the private sector and how the public sector is kind of envisioning its path to net zero. Right? So I'll leave off there.
Thank you. That's all the time we have. So a big thank you to our panelists. Give them your virtual applause in our chat box there on the right-hand side. We wouldn't be able to host these important discussions without the generous support of our industry partners. So thank you again, PCL, for sponsoring today's webinar. And last but not least, a very big thank you goes out to all of our attendees. And my apologies for not getting to all of your questions today. But your participation through the chat feature and poll questions really drives a level of intimacy for these events that we wouldn't otherwise be able to accomplish. If you follow Actual Media up at the top of your screen, you'll automatically get a notification for the latest information on upcoming webinars. We'd love to hear your feedback on today's session, or if you have some thoughts for future webinar topics, we'd like to hear that too. So thank you again, stay safe, and we'll see you next time.